What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So I get a lot of questions about big swim baits. A lot of you guys have seen just a couple of episodes when I went on the Fish North Georgia show, or you've seen a lot of the posts and things that I put up on Instagram. And a couple of you guys have heard some of the advice and things that I've given out on big swim baits. So you guys have actually gone and tried them out, bought some of the baits that I recommended. You're actually sticking fish on them. I get DMs and stuff all the time of some of my favorite swim baits that I recommended hanging out of a fish's mouth, and I really appreciate that kind of stuff. It lets me know that I'm doing something for you. But I've been asked for some advice, and there's a lot of guys that are just now starting to get into it. Swim bait fishing has kind of exploded in popularity over the past couple of years, especially with the whole virus thing going on right now. And a lot of guys are having a little bit of a struggle trying to get into it. They're throwing baits, they're not getting bites, or they're out getting followers, they're not getting bites, or they're breaking off lines and breaking rods and things like that. So here's a couple of things that I'm going to be able to give you that will make the process a little bit easy for you, and I can shorten the learning curve just a little bit. First of all, you need to have the right gear when you're throwing swim baits. That means the rod, the reel, and the line, and even everything down to the split rings and hooks need to be in alignment. What I mean by that is you have to have, depending on the size of the bait, you can get away with a little bit lighter rod. You can get away with a flipping stick or a heavy jig rod or something like that if you're going to throw a smaller swim bait, something that's 6 or 7 inches long, only weighs 2 or 3 ounces. You can get away with that. You can get away with throwing 17-pound fluorocarbon. You can get away with throwing 15-pound fluorocarbon on some of these baits because they're that small, they're that light, and they don't put a whole lot of strain on the rod. But when you get into big swim baits, the really big ones, and I mean anything that's 8 inches or heavier, anything that weighs 4 ounces or more, you need a dedicated swim bait rod. And these things are very particular. They have a different taper than all the other bass fishing rods that are on the market because they're designed to handle the load of throwing something like this. And so you really need to have a dedicated swim bait rod. I recommend starting out, depending on the size and the overall weight of the bait that you're going to be using, you should get a heavy power swim bait rod that's rated for up to maybe like 6 ounces for a beginner, because you're not going to go and buy the biggest things right out the gate. You're not going to be throwing the heaviest things right out the gate. You need something that you can learn on and gain experience and catch a couple fish on so that you can get the ball rolling. And then maybe if you want to expand later on, then you can pick up some bigger stuff. Or you can just go with the flipping stick that I had brought up earlier. If you got a flipping stick or a frog rod, you can go ahead and you can use that if it's just going to be something, another tool in the arsenal and not, you know, a very big part of what you do. If you're not going to be swim bait fishing a whole lot, you don't want to spend all the money that these things cost, or you don't want to be the guy out there throwing all day, every day, waiting to get one fish, definitely just use whatever it is that you got. The heaviest rod that you got, run with that, and just buy baits that are rated in the weight category for that rod, so that you can just gain some experience and just have it as a tool in the arsenal if this isn't going to be something you're going to be dedicated to. Now, the proper swim bait rod, like I was saying, you can get a heavy power swim bait rod for entry level stuff, but if you take it a step up from there and you want to throw a little bit more big baits, or you're a trophy hunter, you want to get the biggest bass you've ever caught in your life, you should take it a step up from there. Get an extra heavy. An extra heavy is the most versatile of the swim bait rods, in my personal opinion, because it allows you to fish a lot of those smaller baits, but it also allows you to kind of dabble in some of those little bit bigger things. See, I can throw something this big. This is a Matt Lure's Magnum Strong Gill. I believe this thing weighs just under 4 ounces, maybe like 3.5, 3 3/4, something like that. I can throw weight baits on it. I can throw stuff like my slammer, the flat-sided slammer. But also, using the extra heavy gives me the ability to throw baits that are a little bit bigger, like this. This is a 10-inch glide bait, JDM lure. This is the Wild Lures Wild Beat. And I can throw things that are a little bit bigger, and I can throw some of the little bit smaller baits at the same time. And it does really good for those right down the middle kind of baits that weigh, say, 4 or 5 ounces. So you can get away with using the middle of the road rod for a bunch of different things. So if you're going to take swim bait fishing seriously and you've got fish that are big enough to warrant using something like this in your area, I definitely recommend that you would go with the extra heavy swim bait rod. Now, the important thing about it is the taper. I like a little bit stiffer rod for soft baits, and I like a little bit softer rod for hard baits, and here's why. See, with soft baits, I'm going to pick up a hood. With soft baits, they normally have just a single hook, if you can see that. Just a single jig hook most of the time. And if they don't, they normally have just a single hook on the bottom or something like that. And having a little bit stiffer rod is the same concept as fishing a crankbait versus fishing a jig. See, when you're fishing a single hook bait like a jig or a chatterbait or a flipping rig, something like that, and you get bit by a fish, what do? You reel down the slack and you jack them. You hit them hard with that hook set. Same deal here with the swim bait. And I like it to be a little bit stiffer because it hammers that hook home really good and the rod doesn't fold up. And the way that you're fighting a fish on a swim bait is you're not going to play them out like how you would on a very light finesse fishing setup. You're going to hit them as hard as you can. You're going to grind them into the boat. You're going to jack them, turn them, keep that rod pinned, and just keep reeling until he gets up to the bank or up to the boat. But when I'm fishing a hard bait, the majority of the hard swim baits have treble hooks on them. And the important thing about that is you need a little bit softer rod because it has more give to it and it will absorb some of the shock, especially in warmer water when we're using hard baits. Hard baits we normally use in a little bit warmer water, during the mid-spring up to like early fall, mid-fall period. You don't have to start throwing most hard swim baits until it starts to get really cold. And the fish are more active during that time of year. They're jumping out of the water, they're making bulldog dives, they're trying to go back into cover and stuff like that. You need to be able to absorb some of that shock because they literally fight harder when the water is warmer. Most of the time, assuming that you're fishing for largemouth. I'm talking about largemouth right now. But you need a rod that's going to be able to absorb some of that shock. Now, as far as line, some guys like to use fluorocarbon, some guys like to use braid. Personally, I like to use copolymer because it's the most forgiving. It absorbs a lot of the shock. It's not as stretchy as monofilament. You stay away from monofilament when you're swim bait fishing. Do not use monofilament. It's a big rubber band. You're using this big heavy bait, and it is just not sufficient to be using for swim baits. It casts well. It's just not going to land you very many fish. Fish are going to be jumping out the water. They're going to be spitting that thing out. You're not going to get very good hook sets. A lot of times when you're using straight monofilament, it's too spongy. It just has a little bit too much give to it. So I like to use copolymer. Copolymer is a little bit different mix. It's a little bit stiffer than monofilament, but it's not as stiff as fluorocarbon. And I like to use that in 25-pound test line because it will warrant me. It gives me enough wiggle room where I can throw big baits and I can throw some of the middle of the road baits, and it can even dabble into some a little bit smaller baits too. But I'm normally throwing at least mid-grade and higher grade weights of swim baits. I'm not normally using anything smaller than about 7 inches when I pick up my swim bait rod. For all you guys that are just kind of dipping your toes in it, you can definitely go away with just 17-pound fluorocarbon or 17-pound copolymer with a smaller glide bait, and you can get away with that just fine. But you guys that like to use braid, you have to go very, very heavy with braid. The reason why is because braid is the least forgiving line on the market. Braid will punish you if you don't know what you're doing with it. You have to have at least 65-pound braid on a lot of these bigger swim baits. Some guys will even go up to 80. Some guys will even go heavier than that. I've seen guys throw 100-pound braid on some of the biggest swim baits. And the reason for that is because braid has zero stretch. There's no stretch. There's no give at all. Where monofilament is too spongy and it has way too much give to it, braid is nothing. So if you throw a big swim bait like that wild beat that I just showed you, if you throw something like this, throw something like that on braid, and you get a backlash, and it buries down into the spool, it's going to snap and keep flying. You're going to lose that lure, and it's going to be gone. Because there's just too much weight to be throwing something like this on lighter braided line. And a lot of you guys are getting a lot of backlashes and having to dig down into the spool because what a lot of guys don't realize that are just getting started is that braided line, yes, it is stronger than a lot of other lines per same diameter. But even though you've bought 30-pound, 20-pound, 15-pound braid, it has the diameter of a thin monofilament. It's not really the same. It has a thin diameter for the same pound test line as monofilament or fluorocarbon or one of those other lines. So even though you've bought 30-pound braid, it's literally the thickness of like 8-pound monofilament. And so it doesn't manage well on the spool. So going with a heavier braided line will make it more manageable on your reel too. So you can get away with using it if you want to. There's a lot of guys that just like braid. So if you're going to go with braid, definitely go heavier. As far as hooks, I like to use, it depends on what the rig is and what the setup is, but majority of the time, I'm going to go with 3 brands. I like to use Mustad, I like to use Owner, and sometimes I'll use some of these Japanese brands, like Decoy sometimes. But most of the time, I'm running with Owner. And the hooks and split rings that I put on there are dependent on the bait itself and the target fish that I'm going after. So if you're a guy who's using a big swim bait and you're looking for pike, muskie, stripers, you want to go with a big, heavy gauge wire hook, like a 3X or a 4X sometimes. I know you think that's really thick and you might be using a saltwater grade hook, but remember, you're using a big, heavy rod, you're using really stiff, really heavy line, and you're hooking a really big fish and you're trying to bulldog him to the boat. You can bend that hook out pretty easily, so you got to go up in that wire gauge size. As far as largemouth go, I don't normally go a whole lot bigger than 2X, definitely not bigger than 3X. And I like to use the Mustad triple grips and a size 1/0 on a lot of my wake baits and a lot of my glide baits. Those hooks work pretty well, but I also like to use Owner. The Owner Stinger trebles, those work really well too if you're looking for a replacement hook. As far as split rings, the Owner Hyperwire split rings are the best ones on the market. Just about everybody uses those. And that's going to be the setup that you use for swim baits. Now, as far as reels go, you can get away with using a 150 size spool or a 200 size spool on some of these smaller baits, but I definitely recommend that you get at least a 300 size reel to pair with your swim bait rod. Definitely don't go with anything too small because first of all, it's not going to hold as much line. The spool's just too small. It doesn't hold a whole lot of 25-pound and 30-pound test line for these big swim baits. And on top of that, they're just not built to handle that sort of stress. So you'll pick up, it's the same concept as using a slower gear ratio reel versus a higher gear ratio reel when those guys who like to fish offshore use deep diving crankbaits and things like that. If you pick up, say, you've got a low profile bait casting reel and you're deep cranking on a hump offshore somewhere in 35 feet of water. Okay, well, you need a bigger spool on it, you need a low gear ratio on it. Why? Okay, when you go offshore, you're throwing these deep diving crankbaits, there's a lot of torque. There's a whole lot of torque and it's putting a lot of strain on that setup. You need that bigger spool so you can get the casting distance, but you need it to be slow because it's basically a winch when you're fishing it. If you use, there's a lot of guys that go offshore and they'll fish a heavy load or they'll fish something like a crankbait, deep diving crankbait, and they'll end up burning the reel out, stripping the gears and stuff in it because it's just not built for it. They'll fish like a 7-2-1 or something offshore, and then after a couple of trips, it's burned out. It's all tore up. It's just too much pressure on the reel. It's just not built for it. And so you want to go with those slower gear ratio reels because they last longer. Same thing with swim bait fishing. The bigger reel is just built to handle a heavier load and it lasts you longer and it will cast better over a longer period of time. You're not going to constantly be burning out reels and replacing them all the time. Now, with hard baits, I like to go with a little bit faster reel. I might use like a 6-6-1 or maybe even like a 7-1-1 or something like that on a lot of my hard baits because the water is warmer and we're normally fishing them a little bit faster. But on soft baits, I like to go with a little bit slower gear ratio reel because we're normally using them in a little bit colder water and we're trying to keep them in the strike zone for a longer period of time. So definitely, if you wanted to go with a middle of the road sort of reel, we'll go with the 6-speed because you can speed up a little bit and get those hard baits to go a little bit faster, and you can slow down a little bit and get those soft baits to go a little bit slower if you had to. So if you could only have one, pick up a 6-speed reel. Now, as far as rods go, like I was saying, I use a little bit stiffer rod on soft baits. I use a little bit more giving rod on the hard baits. Reason why is because those hard baits most of the time have treble hooks. And you really need to be able to keep those hooks pinned. They're going to jump, they're going to thrash, they're going to pull, they're going to dive, they're going to do all types of crazy stuff. And you need to be able to absorb that shock. So you need a rod with a little bit more give, at least maybe like 20%, 30% tip. give in the rod tip. Now that helps you be able to cast further because you're going to get a little bit more bend in the tip of the rod, so it's going to launch baits a little bit better because it loads up under the pressure of the bait. The soft baits, I like it to be a little bit stiffer because most soft baits just have one jig hook, or they have just one single hook somewhere on the bait. They all look kind of crazy these days, some of these newer baits. They just have one solid hook on them somewhere, and the way that you would do it when you get bit is the same way that you would fish a jig or you would fish a worm. You would reel up the slack, jack them, burn them into the boat, and that'll be that. But you can't do that with a treble hook bait, say like a jerk bait or a crankbait. You got to play that fish out. Same concept when you're swim bait fishing. If you hook them on a swim bait rod and it has treble hooks on it, it's too stiff, you're getting losing fish all the time. So you got to kind of counteract that by using a rod that has a little bit more give. So that's just a little bit of surface level information, just kind of off the top of my head, that I'm trying to remedy some of you guys' problems with. I'm going to put a link at the comment section of this video with the episode of me on the Fish North Georgia show, getting a little bit more information, getting a little bit more in depth about these things. And I'm also going to come up with a video tomorrow explaining a little bit more about swim bait techniques and baits and where you would put them and how you would fish them to deliver some better results for a lot of you guys that aren't getting bit and you can't seem to find a fish on them. I hope that helps out a lot of you guys. I'm going to film a couple of other videos too, discussing fishing line and discussing big fish in general. There's a lot of guys who are like, man, I catch fish, but I can't get on any big ones. I see you catch all these big fish. Where are you getting it? How are you doing this? So I'm going to explain big fish behavior versus small fish behavior as well, so that a lot of you guys can get an increase in size over time too. So I hope that helps you guys out. I got some editing to do. I'll see you soon.